In the 1970s, in Brezhnev's Soviet Union, the war, the memory of World War II, was arguably the most important defining story for the Soviet regime. By this point, it was 50 years on from the Russian Revolution. The generation that had experienced the tumult and the excitement of the revolution was largely passing. The generation that was in power was a generation that had been forged by the experiences of the Stalin time, and maybe more dramatically still, by the experiences of World War II. So this was their story, the way that they had to legitimize their power. So telling the war story for an American audience, to let that audience know the way the Soviets understand the experience, was a way of getting across what the Soviet Union represents today. It was a very important message of the film. There really was, as best we can describe it, a cult of the war that sought to identify in the story of the war the legitimating motifs of the Soviet state. That the war defined the commitment of the Soviet people to repelling the invader. It defined the tremendous capacities of the Soviet system to mobilize its population, to build up industry, to engage in a fight to the death with an impossible foe. And it, in some very direct sense, seemed to speak to the validity of socialism, to the fact that a socialist system can indeed work even in the most dire of circumstances. And there are all kinds of other little pieces within that cult of the war that also show up in the film. I mean, the intense emphasis on the suffering of the Soviet people, which becomes a way in the handling of the state of validating Soviet claims in the post-war period. If the Soviets suffered this much in the war to defeat the Germans, then they deserve, this much in effect on the other side of the war, in the peace, in the post-war period. By emphasizing the enormous costs borne by the Soviet Union during the war, the Soviet state found itself able to obviously insist on certain returns at war's end. There were political returns in the basic fact that the Soviets and the Western powers agreed on what amounted to a de facto division of Europe. There's an awful lot of controversy about exactly what was traded in the Great Wartime Conferences, especially at Yalta, which was held in February 1945, as the war's end was imminent. But the basic fact is that there was an understanding that the Soviet Union, given its enormous sufferings during the war, would have an obvious role to play in rebuilding Europe to serve its strategic purposes. And that would mean effectively being in charge of Eastern and Central Europe to establish the useful security corridor that could block an invasion like this in the future. And they also secured, I think you could say, a broader international sympathy that paid off for them in their international political dealings. Not just in the West, but in the broader colonial world. The war is ending in 1945 in an age of empire. The Soviet Union has defeated Nazi Germany. It's borne enormous costs. It's interpreting the war as a defeat of fascism and imperialism, and it's positioning itself to speak for, in effect, all peoples that could be under another power's boot. And this becomes an easy way to argue against the domination of empires in the world, especially the British Empire. The title of The Unknown War is curious at first glance because for any Soviet citizen, this war was not in the least bit unknown. Obviously, the war was enormous. It touched virtually every Soviet family. And of course, it became a great story of the Soviet post-war experience, a constant reiteration of the themes of the war. There's no way in which your average Soviet citizen in the late 70s could not have known about the war and could not have known about the different stock elements of the way the war story is being told in this film. But the part of the Soviet presentation of the war reflected a sense of, how would I put it, frustration with the Western allies' insufficient appreciation of the Soviet sacrifice. This in the Cold War period became an important plank in the way the cult of the war was developed for domestic consumption, for the Soviet public. We suffered inordinately on a scale that can barely be measured, while our Western allies at the time came to our aid partially and late. The title, The Unknown War, has an ironic ring for a Russian viewer. It's an unknown war to them, to the foreigners, to the Westerners, to the Americans who should know better but don't. But there is some room for accepting the validity of the title, The Unknown War, when seen from an American perspective. Because by this time, the late 1970s, the story of the Eastern Front had been largely obscured in the broader narrative telling of World War II for American audiences. In the time of the war, when the war was on, the American public was actually, by most measures, fairly well informed about the Soviet fight. There were Western correspondents behind the Soviet lines. There were stories being filed from the Soviet front. There was attention in American newspapers to the major turning points of the war and to the degree of Soviet sacrifice. But in the early Cold War period, the American view of the war begins to change, because now the Soviet Union is no longer an ally but a new adversary. The Americans have a new Germany to tend to, West Germany. And gradually, as a result of these two factors, the story of the Eastern Front becomes eclipsed. That is to say, the story of the Soviet sacrifice in the Eastern Front becomes muted. I mean, there's still a place for Stalingrad in the broad narrative of the war. There's still a place for the Soviet victory at Berlin and the meeting between the Americans and the Soviets at the Elbe River and other places in central Germany. But the full measure of appreciation for the weight of the war that was carried by the Soviet Union falls off. And by the time Burt Lancaster and the film crew show up in the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, I think that the material that they're presenting to the American viewer would have been fairly poorly known, dimly known, and the footage would never ever have been seen.
We must be optimistic, because the future of mankind depends upon the ability of the leaders of the Soviet Union and of the United States to work out our differences in such a way that we can be constructive and not destructive. We can bring hope to people all over the world.
My sense of the series as a sort of voice in the debate of the Cold War is that this presentation is a search for a useful middle ground, a kind of general position of compromise and understanding that's going to justify détente initiatives to ease the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States in what was then the present of the late 1970s. Better not to go into too many details, better not to open up too many controversies. The most useful thing to do is to just remember that for a period, we joined forces to defeat an obvious common enemy, and we can acknowledge the sacrifice made on both sides. And if you actually follow some of the subtle turns and twists in the 20 episodes, there are periodic references to the fight unfolding in other places. And there are certain key points during the narrative where there's an emphasis on direct collaboration, the American support of the Soviet war effort through Lend-Lease and the delivery of enormous numbers of supplies to the Soviet Union by the last year and a half of the war. These are clearly opportunities created by the producers of the film, Soviet and the American side, for looking at the present and figuring out ways to get along. There's no question that this film helps the American viewer to understand some very important points about the Soviet war with Germany. First of all, it's the sheer scale of the war, that it unfolded across enormous spaces and involved millions of fighting men and millions of civilians. The scale of suffering and destruction is also very eloquently displayed in the film. The repeated footage of murdered civilians, of desolated cities and villages. There's a powerful visual reminder of the practical, immediate material costs and scale of the war. And I think in that basic sense, it's hard to argue with the narrative position of the film. This is a vision of the war that most Americans simply would not have seen in a typical American or Western representation of the Soviet front. There are a number of episodes that stand out in getting the story right in a general sense, even if some details along the way might be controversial for certain historians. For example, the episode To the East, which is one of the earlier sections of the film, is a presentation of one of the great sort of unsung accomplishments of the Soviet system during the war, and that was to pack up and move out something like 1,200 factories from the western regions of the Soviet Union that were likely to be occupied by the Germans. In a remarkable, intense scramble, the Soviet government directed workers and army units to dismantle these factories, put them on trains, and move them to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, where they could be rebuilt, put on a military armaments footing, and be turned around to serve the purposes of the front. This is a very important story in the ultimate Soviet victory against the Germans. It's a story we don't know about much in the West, and here it's nicely, I think, held up to view. And in that sense, I think it's a very successful episode overall. I also think the episode on the Allies that comes towards the end of the 20 series ultimately gets the picture right, even though here we find any number of controversial moments that the film glosses over. In the West, by this period, it was customary to assume that one of the big stories to be told about the Soviet war was the story of Lend-Lease and the Western material support for the Soviet war effort, both in delivering armaments, delivering trucks, and in putting, in some cases, fighters on the ground to help on the Soviet front. Most famously, this American bomber squadron that was based in and out of Poltava, which is a town in central Ukraine. Americans, if they knew anything about the Soviet front, they knew that the Americans were also fighting the good fight with the Russians there, helping them in their days of need. But if we take a very sober, practical look at the dynamics of the Lend-Lease commitment, we see that during the most difficult period of the Soviet war against the Germans, the Western aid was relatively small. It was climbing as the war continued and became remarkably significant by the last year and a half in the war. But in reality, by that point, the major tide of the war had turned. During this very, very difficult period of 1942 into the early part of 1943, the Soviets weren't fighting alone, they were fighting with allies. But they weren't fighting with the enormous material support of the Allies that would come the following year. So when, in that episode, we hear the narrator remind us that the commitments, the material commitments of the Western Allies were significant, but that the ultimate victory was won by the Soviet Union, I think that, broadly speaking, that's a correct interpretation, and it helps to sort of balance our own mythologies of the role we played in winning the war on the Soviet side. It's very useful for an American audience to get some sense of the role that the Soviet Union played in the war against Japan, which comes at the very end of the war, August 1945, when, following agreements made between the Western powers and the Soviet Union at Yalta, the Soviets mount what amounts to an enormous invasion of northern China and the North Pacific islands, Sakhalin and the Kuril chain north of Japan. This is a story that is poorly known in the Soviet Union and virtually absent from the way the story of the Pacific War is told in the West, but it's significant for setting up an understanding of the history of the Cold War in East Asia, which is easily as important a story as the Cold War in Europe. So there too, I think the film gets it right. And then in the broadest sense, you know, the emphasis on the tactical contributions of the Soviet leadership, of the generals who are so frequently mentioned across the episodes, Zhukov, Konev, Malinovsky. That's a very important correction to one of the interpretations that is sort of settled in the Western popular view of the Eastern Front by this time, which was that the Soviet Union ultimately defeated Nazi Germany because it was able to mobilize more men and more industrial might, and the Germans were also undone by the difficulties of fighting in the Soviet theater, so far from their own bases, fighting against elements for which they weren't prepared. They were defeated by General Winter. This was one of the easy stories told in the West about the Nazi defeat at the hands of the Soviets. And by and large, this is just its own mythological distortion of what was happening. The Soviet command executed the war with remarkable skill at certain key moments. And even though we're more likely to emphasize the German military skill, certainly in the first part of the war, the fact is that the Soviet command structure was remarkably successful. In this film, it sort of plays to the way the Soviets want to tell that story. There's no question that it's self-serving, but I think it's also a useful corrective to some of the easy generalizations that were made in the West at the time. To the degree that we see Hitler in the film, he's presented as a commander-in-chief who really can't stop meddling with the objectives of the war, contradicting his generals, insisting on fights that are hopeless, the classic example being Stalingrad, fight to the death. Fortress Stalingrad can never be surrendered. But the image we get of Stalin in the war is of a commander who is more adaptive, ultimately, in the end, prepared to listen to his generals and let generals take center stage. Broadly speaking, I think that's also correct. It's not that Stalin didn't make terrible strategic errors. He clearly did. And in fact, so many of the disasters of the first part of the war for the Soviet side were a consequence of Stalin's poor reckoning. But by and large, it's true that he stepped away from meddling with the running of different campaigns. And it's brought very, very much to the fore, again, at the very end of the film, in the next to last episode that focuses on the war in the Far East, when we're reminded that just as this million-man Red Army is about to descend on northern China and the Kuril and Sakhalin Islands, Malinovsky, the general in charge of the Far Eastern Front, is getting in contact with Stalin to get his final approval on the great attack that's going to come. And Stalin was confident enough, we're told by the film, that he didn't even have to bother telling Malinovsky to go ahead with the plan. He was just going to focus on spending a movie night at the Kremlin watching a film that had just been given to him by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, I mean, or a little bit earlier, given to him by FDR. So, the film allows us to see a commander-in-chief that was confident enough to trust his accomplished generals. And I think, by and large, that's a useful interpretation of the way in which politics could take a second seat to the military objectives of the war, and leaving those military objectives to be pursued by the military professionals rather than